My world was whispers and pages, the quiet calm of our town's library. He thought shattering it, and me, would be easy. A few typed words, a life undone. But he forgot something crucial about librarians. We're meticulous researchers, and I'd been researching him for years. He thought he was writing my final chapter. What happens when he discovers I'm the one holding the red pen? The scent of old paper, mingled with the faint sweet aroma of lemon polish and binding glue, that was the enduring perfume of my world, the very air I breathed. For 32 years, the Ashworth Public Library had been more than my place of employment. It was my sanctuary, my meticulously ordered universe where knowledge was sacred and silence golden. I was Eleanor Vance, though most townsfolk simply knew me as the Librarian. A quiet woman, they'd say, always with a book in hand or ready to find one for you. My days unspooled with a predictable rhythm, the gentle click-clack of the date stamper, the whisper of turning pages, the soft hum of the ancient heating system in winter, and the contented sighs of children lost in worlds far beyond our sleepy little town during story hour. I moved among the towering shelves like a familiar spirit, my footsteps barely registering on the worn linoleum, a guardian of narratives, a purveyor of dreams and facts. The serenity of my days, the almost monastic calm of my existence, perhaps, made me seem simple, uncomplicated. A woman content with her Dewey Decimals and her cardigans. Does Eleanor's quiet dedication, this unassuming diligence, remind you of someone in your life who possesses an unseen depth, a strength others might overlook? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear them. People saw the neatly arranged pencils on my desk, the perpetually calm expression, and assumed the waters within ran just as still. They didn't see the patterns I discerned. In returned books, the subtle shifts in a patron's reading habits that often told a story far more revealing than any gossip whispered over the counter. They didn't know that a mind trained to categorize and cross-reference vast swathes of information doesn't simply switch off at the library doors. My life was one of observation, a quiet accumulation of data. It was a skill honed not just by profession but by necessity, a defense mechanism learned early. And then there was Arthur Pennington. He'd become a fixture in the library. Over the past few years, a man who cultivated an air of scholarly charm, always with a kind word for me, always with a question that made him seem engaged, intelligent. He'd praise my organizational skills, my ability to unearth obscure texts. He'd say things like, "Eleanor, you're a marvel. This library wouldn't be the same without you." His flattery was smooth, almost imperceptible, like the fine layer of dust that settled on the highest unread volumes. He seemed to appreciate the quiet order I maintained, or so I believed. He often spoke of his own research, vague projects that involved local history, sometimes genealogy. He'd spend hours at a particular table in the reference section, poring over microfilms, taking copious notes in a small leather-bound journal. I, of course, facilitated his requests, pulling down heavy ledgers, adjusting the finicky microfilm reader. He was always polite, always patient, even when the ancient machine whirred and protested. He'd look up, offer a disarming smile, and say no trouble at all, "Eleanor, these old things have character." And I would nod, returning to my desk, but a part of my mind would remain, sifting, cataloging his behavior, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a specific document, the way his eyes would dart towards the windows when he thought no one was looking. It began subtly, this research of mine into Arthur. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more an instinct, the same instinct that told me a particular book was misshelved before I'd even reached the correct aisle. He started asking for records that seemed incongruous with his stated interests. Property deeds from decades past, council meeting minutes that were dry as bone but held, I suspected, tiny, overlooked details. He'd always have a plausible reason, a new tangent to his research. I'd listen, nod, and make a mental note. My own internal database on Arthur Pennington was growing, entry by entry, cross-referenced with a librarian's precision. He never saw me as anything more than the helpful, slightly faded woman who fetched things for him. The town of Ashworth. itself is a character in this unfolding drama, a place where everyone knows your name or thinks they do. It's a town that prides itself on its history, its families who have lived here for generations. Arthur, a relative newcomer by Ashworth standards, had integrated himself smoothly, joining the Historical Society, donating generously to the school fundraiser. He was building a persona, brick by careful brick, and most people bought the facade, without a second glance. But I, who dealt in stories, in the difference between fiction and nonfiction, began to sense that his narrative had too many convenient plot holes, too many characters introduced and then quickly forgotten. He was, I suppose, like a poorly researched novel, full of grand pronouncements but lacking in supporting evidence. He'd mention an illustrious ancestor, a connection to some famed local event, but when I'd casually try to verify these claims through our extensive archives, the threads would often unravel, leading to dead ends, or, more tellingly, to different names, different families. I never confronted him, of course. That wasn't my way. My way was the quiet gathering of facts, the silent accretion of truth, much like the slow, steady work of a coral reef, building something solid and unshakable beneath a seemingly placid surface. He believed his intelligence, his charm, made him invisible, or rather, made me invisible. He thought I was just part of the scenery, like the grandfather clock in the main hall, ticking away reliably, noticing nothing. He couldn't have imagined that the mind he so casually dismissed was meticulously piecing together a puzzle he didn't even know he was presenting. The library, my quiet domain, was not just a repository of published works. It was becoming the archive of his undoing, though he walked through its doors every day, blissfully, arrogantly unaware. He was so focused on the information he was trying to extract that he never considered the information he was inadvertently giving away. And I, the quiet librarian, was a most diligent student of his careless curriculum. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, like the subtle change in air pressure before a storm. Arthur's visits became more frequent, his requests more specific, more urgent. The pretense of casual, scholarly interest began to fray around the edges, revealing a flicker of something else, something akin to desperation. He started asking for access to the library's restricted archives, the ones containing delicate, centuries-old documents, town ledgers, personal correspondence of Ashworth's founding families, items usually only handled by myself or the town historian, and then only with white gloves and extreme care. His justifications were elaborate, citing a need to cross-reference minute details for a supposed academic paper of great importance, one he claimed would shed new light on Ashworth's formative years. I remember one particular afternoon. The library was unusually quiet, the air thick with the smell of impending rain. Arthur was hunched over a fragile, vellum-bound ledger from the early 1800s, a book detailing land grants and familial inheritances. I had reluctantly allowed him access under my direct supervision. He thought I was engrossed in cataloging new acquisitions, but my attention was almost entirely on him. His breathing was shallow, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible movement of his hand as he traced a line of faded ink and a subsequent minuscule tear near the brittle edge of a page. It was no bigger than a fingernail clipping, perhaps even accidental. But his reaction was what truly caught my attention. He didn't gasp, didn't look up in dismay. Instead, his eyes darted towards me, a quick, furtive glance, before he subtly tried to smooth the tear with his thumb, as if hoping it would magically mend itself, or better yet, that I hadn't noticed. I said nothing, of course. I merely made a mental note, another entry in my growing file. But that small, almost insignificant act of carelessness, and his attempt to conceal it, was like a key turning in a rusty lock. It suggested a disregard for the very history he claimed to revere, a willingness to damage the irreplaceable in pursuit of what? It wasn't the behavior of a dedicated scholar. It was the behavior of someone with a hidden agenda, someone for whom these precious artifacts were not objects of study, but mere tools, or perhaps obstacles. The polite facade was cracking, and beneath it, I was beginning to see the glint of something harder, more rapacious. His request for privacy also increased. He'd ask if he could work in one of the small, seldom-used study carrels at the back, claiming the main reading room was too distracting, even on its quietest days. I'd oblige, but my internal alarms were ringing louder. The library, my library, was built on a foundation of trust and open access to knowledge, not secrecy and sequestered research. What was he trying to find? Or perhaps, what was he trying to alter or remove that required such isolation? I began to make my own, even more discreet observations, sometimes tidying near his chosen carrel after he'd left for the day, looking for any stray notes, any indentations on the blotter paper, anything that might offer a clue. One evening, after he'd been particularly engrossed in a series of old property maps, I found a crumpled piece of tracing paper in the waste bin near his usual table. It was clearly an attempt to copy a section of one of the maps, specifically a parcel of land on the outskirts of town, near the old Miller farmstead, a place that had been derelict for decades, but was rumored to sit atop an old, forgotten spring. The tracing was inexpert, hurried, but the outline was unmistakable. Why trace a map so crudely when he could have requested a formal, high-quality copy? Unless, of course, he didn't want an official record of his interest in that particular piece of land. This was no longer idle curiosity. This was methodical, covert, and deeply suspicious. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing mosaic. The interest in old deeds, the focus on land grants, the clandestine tracing of property lines, it all pointed towards something tangible, something related to ownership, to acquisition. Arthur wasn't just researching Ashworth's history, he seemed to be mining it for some personal gain. His carefully constructed persona of the amiable scholar was, I suspected, a meticulously crafted tool designed to disarm, to gain access, to exploit the very trust our small town so readily offered. He saw the library not as a repository of shared heritage, but as a treasure chest, and me, the quiet librarian, as the unwitting keeper of the keys. My research into him intensified, though it remained entirely within the ethical bounds of my profession and my access to public records. I cross-referenced his name, the few personal details he'd let slip over the years, with online databases, archival newspaper records from other towns, anything that might provide a clearer picture of who Arthur Pennington truly was before he arrived in Ashworth. What I began to uncover were whispers of similar patterns in other small communities, a charming newcomer, an interest in local history, and then, often, disputed land claims, contested wills, or investments that soured, leaving locals bereft. And the newcomer conveniently vanished. The charming scholar was beginning to look more like a practiced predator. He, meanwhile, remained oblivious, convinced of his own cleverness, of my harmlessness. He'd still greet me with that same easy smile, ask after my day, perhaps comment on the weather, all the while, I believe, plotting his next move, his next extraction from Ashworth's past for his future benefit. He underestimated me profoundly. He saw a woman surrounded by books and assumed my world was confined to their pages. He failed to understand that a life spent navigating stories, discerning truth from fiction, and organizing information creates a mind that is anything but passive. He thought he was the one in control, the one weaving the narrative. He had no idea that I was already several chapters ahead, carefully documenting his every misstep. But the most surprising chapter of his journey, and indeed mine, was yet to come, kept under lock and key. Keep watching to uncover the full truth behind decades of silence. The knowledge of Arthur's probable intentions settled within me, not with a rush of anger, but with a cold, clear certainty, like the precise click of a well-oiled lock engaging. My library, my sanctuary of order and truth, was being used as a staging ground for deceit, and the town of Ashworth, with its trusting nature and its rich, vulnerable history, was his intended prey. The vague unease I had felt for months had now sharpened into a focused beam of understanding. Arthur Pennington was not just a charlatan, he was a predator cloaked in tweed, and his hunting ground was the dusty archives I curated. His interest in the old Miller farmstead, the crude tracing of its boundaries, the furtive glances when he thought himself unobserved, it all pointed to a plan, a deliberate scheme to exploit some forgotten detail for personal enrichment. His demeanor, too, began to carry a new undercurrent of impatience, a subtle pressure that belied his carefully maintained affability. He'd make suggestions about how certain records should be stored or accessed, implying that my methods, honed over 3 decades, were perhaps a little archaic, a little slow for his urgent needs. He once remarked, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "Eleanor, you guard these treasures so diligently, one might think you suspected everyone of ill intent." I merely returned a placid gaze and replied, "I guard them, Arthur, because they are irreplaceable." It was a small parry, but I felt the subtle shift in our dynamic. He was beginning to sense, perhaps, that the path to his goal might not be as unimpeded as he had initially assumed, though I doubt he ever considered me a genuine obstacle. The time for purely passive observation, for the silent accumulation of data, was drawing to a close. While my internal file on Arthur was comprehensive, filled with his inconsistencies, his suspicious inquiries, and the whispers of his past, I knew that to truly counter him, to protect Ashworth's legacy, I needed more than just patterns of behavior. I needed concrete proof of his specific scheme concerning the Miller farmstead. What was it about that dilapidated property and its rumored spring that had captured his avaricious attention? The answer, I felt certain, lay hidden somewhere within the vast, often overlooked collections of my own library, perhaps in a document he had dismissed as irrelevant, or one he simply hadn't yet found. So, under the guise of routine archival, maintenance and overdue cataloging projects, I began my own deep dive, a far more meticulous and informed exploration than Arthur could ever have managed. My search was laser-focused, anything and everything related to the Miller farmstead, its chain of ownership, geological surveys of the area, local folklore pertaining to its spring, forgotten council ordinances, even personal diaries of past Ashworth residents who might have mentioned the property. I worked late into the evenings, the library hushed and empty save for my presence, the glow of my desk lamp a small beacon in the sea of shadowed shelves. It was a painstaking process, sifting through brittle pages, deciphering faded script, cross-referencing names and dates that spanned centuries. The breakthrough came not from a grand, prominently displayed map or a well-known historical account, but from a dusty, unassuming folio tucked away in a section dedicated to early 20th century agricultural surveys. A section Arthur, with his focus on older, seemingly more valuable land grants and deeds, had likely overlooked. Inside, pressed between reports on crop yields and soil compositions, was a thin, hand-drawn addendum to a geological survey from 1923. It was accompanied by a sheaf of brittle correspondence between the then owner of the Miller farmstead, a Josiah Miller, and a fledgling bottling company based in a nearby city. The letters spoke of the unique mineral composition of the spring water on his property, tests that had revealed it to be exceptionally pure, with a distinct taste profile that the company believed had significant commercial potential. There, it was, the treasure. The correspondence detailed initial agreements, plans for infrastructure, and then, abruptly, the communication ceased. A final, brief note mentioned Josiah Miller's sudden passing and the subsequent legal complexities of his estate, which seemed to have fallen into disarray. The bottling company, still small and likely lacking resources for a protracted legal battle or further investment in an uncertain venture, had apparently abandoned the project. The spring and its documented potential had been forgotten, buried under layers of time and bureaucratic neglect, until, I surmised, someone like Arthur, with a talent for sniffing out forgotten opportunities and exploiting legal ambiguities, had stumbled upon a hint of its existence. He wasn't just after land. He was after a forgotten gold mine, a source of valuable mineral water he could claim and commercialize. Arthur, in his arrogance, probably believed he was the only one clever enough to unearth such a secret. He saw the old records as a jumbled, dusty mess, and me as an equally dusty, unthreatening librarian. He couldn't conceive that I, with my intimate knowledge of the collection's every nook and cranny, its obscure connections and forgotten addendums, could piece together his plan with far greater accuracy and understanding than he possessed himself. He was looking for a loophole. I had found the entire forgotten narrative. A quiet sense of resolve filled me, along with a grim satisfaction. This wasn't about a personal vendetta, though his condescension had certainly rankled. This was about stewardship. I was the guardian of Ashworth's collective memory, and that included its forgotten assets and the stories of its people, like Josiah Miller, whose legacy Arthur sought to usurp. He thought he was so close to his prize, but he was operating in the dark, unaware that the quiet librarian already held the spotlight, ready to illuminate his scheme. My next steps began to form in my mind, not as a rash counterattack, but as a carefully orchestrated presentation of facts, much like preparing an impeccably researched exhibit. Arthur Pennington had underestimated the power of a well-kept archive, and he had most certainly underestimated its keeper. He was about to learn that some of the most compelling stories are not found in the bold headlines, but in the carefully preserved footnotes, and that those who dedicate their lives to such details are not to be trifled with. The most telling encounter, however, came about a fortnight after the exhibit opened. Arthur appeared at my desk late one afternoon, just as I was preparing to close. The library was empty, the silence amplifying the tension he carried into the space. He looked tired, his usual dapper appearance somewhat disheveled. He didn't meet my eyes directly, instead focusing on a point just past my shoulder. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, almost a murmur. "That exhibit, quite thorough." I simply nodded, waiting. "You seem to have a remarkable grasp of Ashworth's minutiae." Again, I offered no verbal response, just a steady, calm gaze. He shifted his weight, a small, nervous gesture. "Some might say," he continued, a hint of his old manipulative charm attempting to surface, "that such a deep dive into old, forgotten matters could be misconstrued, stirring up things best left buried." I finally spoke, my voice even, devoid of accusation. "History is never truly buried, Arthur. It simply awaits rediscovery. My role is to facilitate that." He let out a sigh, a sound of profound weariness or perhaps defeat. "The Miller Spring," he said, the words almost forced out. "It's just an old wives' tale, a forgotten pipe dream. There's nothing there of any real value." This was his last feeble attempt at misdirection, to downplay the significance of what he now knew I had uncovered. I met his gaze then, holding it. The correspondence from the bottling company in 1923, their chemical analysis of the water, their proposed investment. Those are hardly old wives' tales, Arthur. They are documented facts. Facts which, I believe, you were also well on your way to uncovering perhaps for your own, scholarly purposes? A faint flush rose on his cheeks. He knew he was cornered, not by accusations, but by meticulously presented evidence. He had no counter-argument, no plausible deniability left. The scholar had been out-researched. He mumbled something about his research being misinterpreted, and that Ashworth was too small-minded to appreciate forward-thinking ventures. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and left, not with a grand exit, but with the subdued retreat of a man whose carefully constructed reality had crumbled. I watched him go, a solitary figure receding into the twilight, no longer the confident, charming predator, but a diminished man, stripped of his pretense. I never saw Arthur Pennington in the Ashworth Public Library again. Within a month, word trickled through town that he had moved away, his departure as quiet and unceremonious as his ambitions had once been grand. The Miller Spring, however, was now a topic of considerable local interest and opportunity. The town council, armed with historical precedent and a clear understanding of its potential, began exploring ways to responsibly develop it as a community asset, perhaps a small municipally owned bottling plant or a protected natural resource. My little exhibit had done more than just expose a charlatan. It had potentially unlocked a new chapter for Ashworth, a chapter rooted in its own, almost forgotten, history. My life returned to its familiar rhythms, the scent of old paper, the whisper of turning pages. But something had shifted, both within me and in the way the town perceived its quiet librarian. I had learned that knowledge, meticulously gathered and strategically deployed, was a power far more formidable than overt aggression. And Ashworth, I believe, learned that its greatest treasures were not just in its past, but in the vigilance of those dedicated to preserving its truth. The story of Arthur Pennington and the Miller's Spring became another thread in the rich tapestry of Ashworth's local lore, a cautionary tale perhaps, but also a story of quiet triumph. If this tale of quiet diligence and the power of truth resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a story where the underdog, armed with knowledge, turns the tables. Your share helps these narratives of quiet strength find a wider audience. Years have passed since Arthur Pennington's quiet departure from Ashworth. The Miller Spring Bottling Company, a modest, community-owned initiative, is now a reality. It doesn't aim for national dominance, but it provides local jobs and the clear, cool water, marketed with a label that features a sketch of the old Miller farmstead and a tagline, "Ashworth's hidden gem, rediscovered," has become a point of local pride. The profits help fund community projects, including, fittingly, an expansion of the Ashworth Public Library's historical archives and a new children's wing. The library itself remains my domain, though I now have a bright young assistant, eager to learn the intricacies of our collection and the stories hidden within. I still walk among the shelves, the scent of old paper and lemon polish a constant comfort. My days are filled with the familiar rhythm of a librarian's life, but there's a subtle difference in the air, a quiet understanding that has settled over Ashworth. The tale of the librarian who saved the spring, as some of the older children now whisper it during story hour, much to my feigned chagrin, has become a piece of local folklore. It's an embellished version, of course, as such tales often are, but at its heart, it carries a truth. That knowledge, even when quietly held, can be a powerful shield, and that unassuming individuals can be capable of extraordinary vigilance. Occasionally, a new resident, perhaps hearing fragments of the story, will look at me with a curious glint in their eye, as if trying to reconcile the image of the calm, bespectacled librarian with the figure from the local legend. I simply offer them a gentle smile and ask if I can help them find a book. For the truth is, my actions weren't born of a desire for heroism or recognition. They were born of a deep-seated respect for truth, for history, and for the integrity of the institution I served. Arthur Pennington was merely an anomaly, a disruption in the carefully ordered world of facts and narratives that I had dedicated my life to preserving. His story serves as a quiet reminder that those who seek to exploit the past or manipulate the truth often underestimate the quiet observers, the meticulous record keepers, the guardians of stories. They forget that history has a way of leaving indelible footprints, and that there are those who know precisely how to read them. My research into Arthur was, in many ways, no different from the research I undertake for any patron seeking information. It required patience, diligence, and an ability to connect disparate pieces of information into a coherent whole. The only difference was the nature of the text and the stakes involved. The library continues to thrive, a vibrant heart in our small town. The new children's wing is always bustling, filled with the next generation of readers and thinkers. Sometimes, I see a child poring over a local history book with an intensity that reminds me, just a little, of my own quiet investigations, and I feel a sense of hope. The best defense against future Arthurs, perhaps, is a community that values its history, understands its resources, and encourages critical thinking from a young age. My life didn't dramatically change in its outward appearance. I didn't seek accolades or a different path. My victory was a quiet one, reflected in the continued integrity of Ashworth, in the gentle bubbling of the Miller Spring, and in the rustle of pages being turned in a library that stood as a testament to the enduring power of knowledge. Arthur thought he was writing his own grand narrative of acquisition and deceit. He simply never realized he had stumbled into a story much older, much stronger than his own, a story curated by a quiet librarian who knew precisely where all the footnotes and all the secrets were kept. And so, the whispers and pages of my world continue to turn. Each day a new entry, a new story waiting to be discovered or, sometimes, to be protected. The red pen I metaphorically wielded then remains, not as a weapon, but as a tool of clarification, of preservation, ensuring that the narratives entrusted to my care remain true, and that those who seek to distort them will always find a meticulously researched counterpoint waiting. For in the quiet halls of knowledge, the most powerful voice often belongs not to the loudest, but to the one who has done their homework. This story has reached its final page for now. If you've journeyed with Eleanor and found inspiration in her quiet strength and intellect, please consider subscribing for more narratives that celebrate the unsung heroes and the profound impact of hidden diligence. Your support ensures these stories continue to be told. The gentle rhythm of the seasons continued to mark time in Ashworth, each bringing its own subtle changes to the town and to the library that remained its steadfast heart. The children who once whispered about the librarian who saved the spring are now young adults, some venturing off to college, others starting their own families and careers within Ashworth's familiar embrace. It's a quiet joy to see them return, sometimes with their own little ones in tow, heading straight for the vibrant children's wing that Josiah Miller's rediscovered legacy helped build. They still greet me with a unique blend of respect and affection, the old stories now a warm, shared memory rather than a whispered legend. The quiet hum of the library around me felt different now, charged with a new purpose. Each book, each file, seemed to stand as a silent witness, ready to corroborate the truth I was about to unveil. Arthur's carefully constructed narrative was about to collide with the unyielding force of documented history. If you, like me, believe in the power of uncovering hidden truths and the satisfaction of seeing deceit brought to light, perhaps you'd consider subscribing to this channel. There are always more stories waiting to be told, more secrets to be revealed, and your support helps bring them into the open. With the full scope of Arthur Pennington's scheme laid bare in the brittle pages of forgotten correspondence, my path forward became unequivocally clear. This was no longer a matter of private suspicion. It was a public trust I needed to uphold. Ashworth's history, its very land, was under silent siege, and I, its unassuming librarian, was perhaps the only one who held the complete map of the battlefield. My strategy would not be one of overt confrontation, not initially. Arthur thrived on manipulating perceptions, on weaving narratives that cast him in the most favorable light. A direct accusation from me, a quiet librarian, might easily be dismissed as the ramblings of an overzealous custodian of dusty records. No, my approach needed to be as meticulous, as irrefutable, as the evidence itself. It needed to be an unveiling, not an attack. I decided to curate an exhibit, not an unusual occurrence for the Ashworth Public Library. We often highlighted local history, notable anniversaries, or the works of local authors. This one, however, would be different. Its theme would be Ashworth's hidden legacies, forgotten ventures, and untold stories. The centerpiece, naturally, would be the story of Josiah Miller and his unrealized dream of a mineral water bottling company, built upon the unique spring on his land. I would lay out the narrative step by step, using facsimiles of the letters, the geological survey addendum, and maps showing the Miller farmstead. I would also, quite deliberately, include reproductions of some of the more general, publicly accessible land grant documents that Arthur himself had spent so many hours poring over, subtly demonstrating that his areas of research had not gone unnoticed. The preparation took several days, conducted mostly after hours when the library was still and I could work undisturbed. Each document was carefully selected, its significance considered. I wrote concise, informative captions, purely factual, letting the historical records speak for themselves. There was a quiet intensity to my work, a sense of purpose that transcended the usual routines of library management. I was not merely arranging an exhibit, I was preparing a meticulously documented indictment, camouflaged as a celebration of local history. The irony was not lost on me. Arthur had used the library as his tool for deception. I would use it as my instrument of truth. Invitations were discreetly dispatched. I targeted key figures in Ashworth, the members of the town council, the board of the Ashworth Historical Society, Mrs. Albright from the Ashworth Chronicle, our small but widely read local newspaper, and a few prominent longtime residents whose families had deep roots in the town. And of course, an invitation was sent to Arthur Pennington himself, presented as a courtesy, given his keen interest in local historical matters. I imagined him receiving it, perhaps with a flicker of self-satisfaction, assuming it was a nod, to his scholarly pursuits never suspecting he was being invited to witness the meticulous unraveling of his own duplicity. The day of the exhibit's unveiling, a modest affair, more of an open house, arrived with a crisp autumn air. I had arranged the display panels near the main circulation desk, impossible to miss. Arthur arrived a little later than the dull others, exuding his usual air of cultivated charm, nodding to acquaintances, a picture of affable interest. I watched him from my desk, pretending to be occupied with paperwork. I saw his gaze sweep over the initial panels, a polite, slightly bored expression on his face. Then, he reached the section on Josiah Miller. I saw his posture stiffen, just for a moment. He leaned closer to examine the reproduced letters, his eyes scanning the text with an intensity that belied casual curiosity. His gaze flickered to the maps, then to the copies of the land grant documents, some of which he would have recognized as items he had personally requested and studied for hours. His face, usually so adept at masking emotion, went through a subtle series of transformations: initial recognition, then a dawning awareness, followed by a tightening around the jaw. He glanced around the room, his eyes briefly meeting mine. There was no accusation in my expression, only the placid, professional demeanor of a librarian overseeing her domain. But in that fleeting moment, I believe he understood. He knew that I knew. He knew that his carefully guarded secret was now public knowledge, laid out for all to see, not as a scandal, but as a fascinating, rediscovered piece of Ashworth's heritage. Mrs. Albright from the Chronicle was particularly intrigued, scribbling notes furiously, her reporter's instinct clearly engaged. Councilman Davies, a man known for his staunch protection of Ashworth's resources, was deep in conversation with the president of the Historical Society, both looking intently at the details of the proposed bottling operation from 1923. Arthur, after a few more minutes of feigning interest, his composure remarkably regained though a certain pallor remained, offered a curt nod in my direction and made a hasty retreat, claiming a prior engagement he had suddenly remembered. He didn't ask a single question about the exhibit. His silence was more eloquent than any protestation could have been. The quiet hum of conversation in the library that afternoon was different. It was energized, speculative. People were rediscovering a lost part of their town's story, and with fine eye on it, a potential asset that had lain dormant for nearly a century. My role was simply that of the facilitator, the one who had brought forgotten facts to light. But as I watched the townspeople engage with the material, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over me. The library had done its job. It had protected its heritage, not by locking it away, but by sharing it openly, transparently. Arthur Pennington had sought to exploit the shadows of forgotten history, but he was about to discover that sunlight is a powerful disinfectant. It's one thing to uncover a secret, but quite another to reveal it in a way that empowers a community, rather than simply shaming an individual. What do you think is the most effective way to bring hidden truths to light, especially when powerful interests are at play? Share your strategies in the comments below. And if you're appreciating Eleanor's meticulous approach to justice, please consider giving this video a like to help others discover her story. The ripples of that afternoon's exhibit were only just beginning to spread. The aftermath of the exhibit was precisely as I had hoped, a quiet, persistent hum of inquiry rather than a sudden, dramatic explosion. Mrs. Albright's piece in the Ashworth Chronicle the following week was a masterpiece of understated implication. Titled, "Forgotten Riches Beneath Our Feet, The Miller Spring and Ashworth's Lost Opportunity," it detailed the historical findings with journalistic integrity, mentioning the library's fascinating new exhibit curated by our diligent librarian, Eleanor Vance. It spoke of the potential value of such a unique water source, especially in an era increasingly focused on natural and locally sourced products. Crucially, it also included a sidebar on the legal complexities surrounding abandoned or unclaimed historical assets, a subtle nod to the very avenues Arthur had likely been exploring. Arthur Pennington, unsurprisingly, became scarce. His daily visits to the library ceased abruptly. When occasionally spotted in town, he appeared preoccupied, his usual gregariousness replaced by a strained politeness. The aura of the charming scholar had begun to tarnish, replaced by the faint but discernible scent of something less savory. He knew, and he knew that others were beginning to know, or at least to ask pertinent questions. The town council, spurred by Councilman Davies and armed with the information from the exhibit, announced a formal review into the status of the Miller farmstead and its associated water rights, citing a need to protect potential town assets. The gears of local governance, though sometimes slow, were now grinding in a direction distinctly unfavorable to any private, clandestine claims. My role in all of this remained, on the surface, unchanged. I was still Eleanor Vance, the quiet librarian, attending to my duties, recommending books, and shushing overly enthusiastic children. But there was a new undercurrent to the interactions I had with some of the townspeople. A knowing glance from Mrs. Peterson as she returned her novels, a firmer handshake from Mr. Henderson, who served on the Historical Society board. They didn't speak of it directly, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a respect that went beyond my ability to locate an obscure gardening manual. I had, in my own quiet way, acted as a guardian of their collective interests, and they, in their own quiet way, recognized it. My assistant, Sarah, who arrived full of youthful enthusiasm and a reverence for books that mirrored my own at her age, has blossomed into a capable and insightful librarian herself. She possesses a keen understanding of modern information systems, seamlessly integrating digital archives with our precious physical collections, yet she also shows a profound appreciation for the tangible history held within the oldest, most fragile volumes. I see in her the same dedication to truth, the same meticulous attention to detail that I have always held dear. It gives me a quiet confidence that the guardianship of Ashworth's stories, its collective memory, will continue with vigor and integrity long after my own tenure has reached its natural close. Not long ago, a group of high school students working on a local history project came to the library. Their teacher, a bright young woman who had herself been one of those children captivated by the Miller Spring saga, had encouraged them to delve into primary sources. One earnest young man, while examining facsimiles of the 1923 correspondence, looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning understanding. He asked, "Mrs. Vance, when you found all this, weren't you scared to go up against someone like Mr. Pennington?" His question, so direct and sincere, resonated through the quiet reference section. I paused, considering my answer. Scared? Perhaps there had been a tremor of apprehension, not of Arthur himself, but of failing to protect the integrity of the records, failing to safeguard a piece of Ashworth's heritage. "Less scared, David," I replied, "and more determined. When you work with facts, with verifiable truth, there's a certain solidity that fear can't easily penetrate. The truth has its own strength. My role was simply to ensure it was clearly presented." He nodded slowly, absorbing this, then turned back to the documents, a new focus in his expression. It was a small moment, but it reinforced my belief in the enduring power of example, the quiet lessons passed down through generations. The world outside Ashworth has, of course, grown louder, faster, saturated with information, and often misinformation. The digital age presents its own challenges to institutions like ours. The fleeting nature of online content, the battle for accuracy, the need to cultivate discernment in a sea of endless data. Yet, the core principles of why libraries exist, why archives are maintained, remain more vital than ever. The careful collection, preservation, and unbiased presentation of information, the fostering of critical thinking, the safeguarding of diverse narratives, these are timeless responsibilities. My encounter with Arthur Pennington, in its own small way, was a testament to the enduring relevance of these duties. Sometimes, particularly on quiet evenings when the library is empty and the scent of old books hangs heavy in the air, I reflect on the curious path my life has taken. I never sought adventure or confrontation. My ambition was always for the quiet pursuit of knowledge, the orderly arrangement of information. Yet, adventure of a sort found me within these very walls. It taught me that courage isn't always about grand gestures or loud pronouncements. Sometimes, it's about the steadfast refusal to allow truth to be obscured, the quiet diligence that unearths what others wish to keep buried. The Miller Spring continues to flow, a tangible symbol of Ashworth's rediscovered heritage, its waters a clear, cool testament to the value of looking deeper, of questioning, of preserving. And the library stands, not just as a building filled with books, but as a living archive, a place where the past informs the present and inspires the future. It's a legacy I am proud to have had a hand in shaping, not through grand designs, but through a consistent commitment to the small, vital details that, when pieced together, tell the most compelling stories of all. Eleanor's story shows how quiet dedication can shape a community for generations, unearthing treasures hidden in plain sight. Is there a local landmark or story in your own town that holds a special meaning? Perhaps one protected or brought to light by an unsung hero, like her? We'd be honored if you shared a piece of your own local lore in the comments below. Every community has its own valuable narratives worth preserving. As the years have gracefully accumulated, like the finest dust on the highest, most undisturbed shelves, my role as Ashworth's librarian has naturally begun to transition. Sarah, my once assistant, is now the chief librarian, her capable hands and keen intellect guiding the library into its next chapter with a blend of modern innovation and deep respect for its traditions. I still come in most days, of course, now as Librarian Emerita, a title that amuses me with its gentle formality. My tasks are less about the daily management and more about special projects, curating exhibits on even more obscure corners of Ashworth's history, mentoring young researchers, and simply being a familiar, reassuring presence among the stacks I know so intimately. The library has become a far more dynamic space than it was in my early days. It's not just a repository of books, but a true community hub, offering digital literacy programs, hosting author talks, providing quiet spaces for students and remote workers, and, of course, continuing its vibrant children's programs. The spirit of inquiry, the thirst for knowledge and connection that I always believed was the library's core purpose, is more alive than ever. It's deeply gratifying to witness, to know that the foundations laid by generations of librarians, myself included, continue to support such a thriving institution. One crisp autumn afternoon, much like the one when the Miller Spring exhibit first opened its doors, a young woman approached me. She was a journalist, not from the Ashworth Chronicle, but from a larger regional publication, doing a series on unsung community heroes. She had heard through various channels the story of the librarian who had quietly outmaneuvered a deceptive outsider, and, in doing so, secured a valuable asset for her town. She wanted to interview me, to tell my story to a wider audience. I was, I admit, hesitant. My preference has always been for the quiet work, the behind-the-scenes diligence, not the spotlight. But as she spoke, her genuine interest not in sensationalism, but in the power of quiet, principled action, I found myself reconsidering. Perhaps, I thought, there was value in sharing the lesson that intelligence and meticulous preparation are formidable tools, that one doesn't need a loud voice or a position of overt power to effect meaningful change. So I agreed, and we sat in the sunlit reading room, the gentle murmur of the library around us, and I recounted the tale of Arthur Pennington and the Miller Spring, much as I have shared it here. I emphasized not my own role, but the power of the records themselves, the undeniable weight of documented truth. When the article was published, it brought a small flurry of attention to Ashworth, and to me. Letters arrived, emails from people in other small towns who had faced similar challenges, who found encouragement in the story. Some even asked for advice on how to protect their own local heritage from predatory interests. I answered them as best I could, always stressing the importance of thorough research, of community collaboration, and of unwavering adherence to facts. It was a reminder that the patterns Arthur represented were not unique to Ashworth, and that the need for vigilance, for guardians of local memory, was universal. Looking back, the incident with Arthur Pennington was but one chapter in a long life dedicated to the quiet magic of books and the enduring power of information. It was, perhaps, the most dramatic, the one that stepped out from the hushed aisles and into the realm of public consequence. But it was an extension of the same principles that guided my everyday: accuracy, integrity, and a profound belief in the value of every story, every fact, meticulously preserved. He thought he could exploit a forgotten footnote in Ashworth's history. He never imagined that the librarian knew all the footnotes by heart. My life remains rooted in Ashworth, in the comforting embrace of its familiar streets and the hallowed halls of its library. The red pen I once metaphorically wielded against Arthur's deceptive narrative now rests, mostly unused, on my desk at home. But the habit of mind it represents, the commitment to clarity, to truth, to ensuring that stories are told accurately and honestly, that remains as sharp as ever. It is the quiet legacy I hope to leave, not just for Ashworth, but for anyone who believes in the profound strength found in knowledge, diligence, and the unwavering courage to stand for what is right, even if one stands quietly. The story of Eleanor Vance, the quiet librarian, is a testament to the fact that true strength doesn't always roar. Often it researches, it prepares, and it presents the undeniable truth with unshakable calm. Her life's work ensured that her community's narrative remained in their own hands. We believe every voice and every story has power. If Eleanor's journey has moved you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and become part of a community that celebrates the quiet heroes and the enduring impact of knowledge. Click that subscribe button, and let's continue to uncover the extraordinary in the seemingly ordinary together.